Welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Excuse me for the 5-minute delay. The explanation is my ineptitude, and my ineptitude is the fact that we've just had daylight savings and the clocks have changed in the UK literally just like 2 days ago. And so we'd sorted the time differences out, and that's now an hour out. And yeah, there you go. And so poor Phil Zuckerman, who is not yet gone to work where he's probably going to do this from, is now at home, probably hasn't even had his breakfast and a coffee yet. And anyway, all I can say is thank you so much, Phil, for just suddenly doing this an hour before you thought you were going to.
That's all right. I'm glad I checked my email. It's all good. I'm glad I'm just thrilled I'm so honored that you read my stuff and wanted to have me on. So that's fantastic.
Well, so first of all, I suppose let's introduce you to the people who may be watching and who will be gradually tuning into this. Do you want to give a little synopsis of who you are and where your expertise lie?
Yeah, I'm Phil Zuckerman. I'm a professor of sociology and secular studies at a small liberal arts college in California called Pitzer College. It's one of the Claremont colleges. And I study secular people, secular culture, secular movements, atheism, humanism, free thought. And I write about secular culture in the United States. I've written about secular culture in Scandinavia. I've dabbled a little bit in the social construction of morality. And yeah, I write books, I blog, I write for Only Sky. I like apples. How's that?
Nice. I mean, that last bit was the most important part, but no, we'll talk about Only Sky as that fits into the whole bigger picture actually later on, because I think that there'll be an interesting sort of journey towards that. I want to say, do you know what? I should have got it. Is it there? Give me two. Literally, it's over there. So my first introduction to you was seeing you in debates some time back, actually doing a couple of debates that I saw on YouTube or another platform some time ago. But then through Luke Galen, who was a podcaster for the Reasonable Doubts podcast, which is my favorite podcast of all time. Sadly, no more. But Luke, you wrote a book with Luke Galen. His God Thinks Like You section on that podcast was all about the psychology of religion. I really started getting into the psychology of religion and therefore the sociology of religion and why. So as a philosopher, it's all about, we argue about, the content of this and that doesn't make sense and this doesn't make sense. And it's all irrelevant because people don't believe for rational reasons. People believe for psychological and sociological reasons. So unless you understand those parts, the philosophy is kind of irrelevant. So I want to plug this book, The Non-Religious, because it is the best book that you can buy that gives you a detailed sociological evaluation of what the non-religious believe and how they believe. Do you want to just say something about this book at all?
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. That is definitely my driest read I've ever written, but it is action-packed with academic research and studies. So it's basically myself, a sociologist, Luke is a psychologist, and Frank Pasquale was an anthropologist. So we basically got the three heads of social science and wrote, what do we know? What is the sociological research, the state of the art? What do we know about the non-religious from a sociological perspective, from a psychological perspective, and an anthropological perspective? And we tried to make it extremely data-driven, research-based, studies. It's basically a presentation of the state of the art of the knowledge right now. And so I'm glad you like it. I do think it's a strong resource if you just want to kind of go, well, where are things at in the social sciences of irreligion and non-religion and secularity?
Do you know what? I so agree with what you said, and you summed it up so well. I got goosebumps. Like that's how much I rate this book, because it is like it's the go-to book for data. As you say, it's data driven, and it's a data driven book expressing exactly what generally non-religious people believe and generally non-religious people do and how they act, either morally or politically or whatever. Exactly. And as such, it is the go-to book. Of course, being data driven, you hope it's not too time stamped because, new data changes and so on and so forth. But I think the general, what you can pick up from that book is just an absolute goldmine. So I advise everyone get that. But we're not really going to talk about that book today. We're going to talk about this book that I finished reading today. So thank goodness this interview has been postponed a couple of times, because it's given me a chance to finish this, and it's such a truly brilliant book. Do you want to talk a little bit about why you wrote this and what it's about? By the way, it's called "What It Means to Be Moral: Why Religion is Not Necessary for Living an Ethical Life."
Thank you. I'll go off and then you just tell me when to shut up. Basically, the journey to that book was circuitous. I'm not trained in philosophy. I hadn't studied ethics in college. I was trained as a social scientist, a sociologist. And the first thing that got me on this path was, I don't know how it is in the UK, maybe it is, but in the USA, there's such a strong idea that morality comes from religion, and without religion, you can't have morality, and not just personal morality, like, am I going to steal this wallet when no one's watching, unless, the eye in the sky, is going to condemn me to hell, but also at the societal level. A lot of Americans think that religion is kind of what keeps society together, functioning, working. And then if we don't all have a strong faith in God, and we're not all going to church, we're not all studying the Bible, chaos will reign, right? We'll have a society will just fall to pieces. And I was drawn to that argument because I thought, well, it's pretty clear cut. You have independent variables, strength of belief in God in a given population, church attendance in a given population, prayer and rates of prayer, whatever. And then we have very objective standard ways to measure societal well-being and health, from life expectancy to infant mortality, to crime rates, to murder rates, to inequality. You can have we do have a whole list of ways to measure how good a society is functioning. And so in my earlier work, I was just kind of doing a sociological analysis where I was saying, well, no, actually, your claim that if religion falls apart, religion will fall apart is not sustainable. That's simply not the case. And the most secularized democracies today are doing just fine, better than fine. They're the best countries in the world. And I thought that was a solid argument against this kind of theocratic, moralistic, conservative agenda. But what I found was that most people still wanted to challenge me and say, well, but how can you be moral if you don't believe in God? Which is just such a silly, ridiculous, self-defeating question and proposition. But it is the one that, I kept getting over and over again. And I didn't really have the training. I didn't really have the knowledge. And so I started reading like anybody would. And I was reading evolutionary psychology. I was reading Sam Harris. I was reading Franz de Waal. I was reading philosophy. I was reading whatever I could find. I was reading Aristotle and all the way up. I was reading, big readers on ethics, and I was reading and reading. And what happened was, I would have students say to me, can you just recommend, one book that explains why you don't have to be religious to be moral, or that you don't need morality to be God? And I would say, well, I can't think of one, but I could think of, this one and this one. And then you got to read this by Paul Bloom, and you got to read this by Pinker, and you got to read this by so-and-so. And I had all these, and Kai Nielsen, I wanted to give them 20 books. And I was like, well, that's not going to do. And I want to be, is there a single book? And it's like, yes, I like certain things about this book and certain things about that book, but there wasn't one book that I felt wrapped it all up nicely in a nice little package. So I said, well, I like to write, and I'm not a philosopher, but I've done a lot of reading the last 5 or 6 years. I'm going to put what I think is the best arguments, and I'm going to lay them all out in a way that I think your average student, aunt, uncle can read. So, I find most other than really good philosophy is crystal clear. Much of the philosophy I read, though, is so dense and difficult to wade through that I wouldn't wish it on Trump Jr. But so, good, like anything, good philosophy is clear and accessible. So I tried my best to write it in a way that that a non-philosophy person could still get. And I tried to also bring in data when I could, studies and research, but also just basic argumentation and polemics and logic and reason, and tried to lay out a case as to why, so I tried to do two things, and I'll sum up here. The book, in a sense, I tried to do two parts. Part one is sort of debunking and deconstructing a God-based approach to morality and why that's problematic, why it's unsustainable, why it doesn't work. And I have kind of 4 main arguments on that front. And then I say, okay, once we've shown that this is not sustainable, this doesn't hold up. Well, what is secular morality? What are its origins? What are its sources? Where does it, quote unquote, come from? What are its constituent parts? What are some of the tenets and values and morals that secular people do exhibit and live by? And, go from there. So I try to do a little deconstructing and constructing, or critique, but also explication of what secular morality is all about. Because I find secular people often can't articulate the morality, religious people can. Oh, I believe, in the 10 Commandments. I believe thou shalt not kill. Like, they have this ready-made, and that's very easy to articulate. Whereas secular people often, there's even the most moral and ethical atheists, when they are asked, well, where do your morals come from? And what are your morals? And why do they have any weight? They get tongue-tied, which only lends credence then to the theological position, which is, see, they can't articulate it. They don't know what it is. How can that be any basis for anything? So I tried to lay it out. I even have a chapter called the Secular Seven, and I try to lay out, 7 key principles that seem to undergird and bolster secular morality. So
I think it's exactly what you do, and you do it really well in there. And to me, the beginning part, I've just written two pieces based on your book, actually, on Only Sky, about divine command theory, because actually what you start out by doing is saying, well, kind of what is morality, and then you look at theistic morality, and say, well, broadly, if you see it as divine command theory, which is to say, you derive your morality from the commands from God, then, you're going to have problems. And this is why you got problems. And I loved your use of the My Lai massacre and rape and horrible actions that took place by the American soldiers in Vietnam, because you say, they were just following orders. And then it's this idea that if you are just going to follow orders without deferring to your own moral reasoning to evaluate those orders, you are just some kind of automaton.
exactly.
And therefore you are not a moral agent. You are just
Exactly.
someone who's really good at following commands. And this is what happened at My Lai. And the people who were then brought up in court said, well, I was just doing it because I was told that was my command, and that wasn't good enough for the court of law there. So actually it's not good enough for you as a theist to say that. And I thought that was just a really great bit of applied philosophy, or exemplifying something quite philosophical with a great example. So that was it was really good. There's lots of great stuff in the book. I was just trying to find the 4 tenets of like secular philosophy that you said, what is morality? And I had the page number here, but I'm all at a fluster. But just to talk about morality for a second in general, I love, because when I do any kind of discussion about philosophy, and any debate with anyone, whether down a pub or with people who really know their philosophy, it always comes back to morality, which is to say that, do you know what, we can argue about this and that and this, but it all comes down to, well, what should you do in this given situation? So therefore, what should you do is all about morality. And then you quote Keenan Malik as saying, philosophy is one long grand quest for a moral compass, an earnest, deeply serious hunt to uncover the true underlying source of human morality. Simply put, the moral compass is us. What do you mean by that? Because I totally agree, but what do you mean?
So it is what we say it is, and people tend to think that that's a flaw, but it's reality. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's no cosmic umpire. If you want to, it's sort of like, I think about it like, let's say you want to play a pickup game of football at the park, and there's no umpire, there's no lines, there's no, but you and your friends want to play. Well, you figure it out. And if someone came along and said, well, but there's no referee, there's no, well, we're doing the best we can and we're having a great game or a shitty game or whatever. My point is that, you always have to, I think you have to start any discussion about morality with definitions. Like, well, when you say someone's moral, that's an adjective. It's a descriptor. It's like calling someone beautiful or wise or funny or, like, what do you mean by that? Or clever or any, and morality is simply the noun version of an adjective, right? So we have to start there. Well, what do you mean by moral? And right away, it's we that answers that question. And we don't answer it definitively. We don't answer it for eternally. We answer it in a given moment, in a given time, in a given situation, from a given perspective. That's the only way it can be, right? There's no invisible fairies that we're listening to. And even if we did, that doesn't make it moral. It just makes,
that's why I love the opening part of your book, the opening section of your book. So for viewers who know me and readers who have read all my stuff, I am what's called a conceptual nominalist. So in philosophical terms, there's a nice bit of jargon to say that I don't believe abstract ideas exist out there in some kind of Platonic realm, that abstract ideas exist in here. And when we agree with each other, we write dictionaries, like literary definitions of words, or encyclopedias. And when we agree on certain moral principles, we write them into law if we can get the voted people into power to do that for us. But what that means is that we aren't discovering moral laws that exist outside of our brains. If all humanity died, right, all sentient life forms died in the universe, there would be no morality. There wouldn't be a hero. There wouldn't be something known as a chair. There might be that matter, but it wouldn't be known as a chair. We wouldn't have mathematics. There wouldn't be loyalty. So these are all constructed mentally. And I've written so much on that. And then the first part of your book is basically that in really easy speak for people to like, not in a good way. It's like perfect. This is a great example of conceptual nominalism as far as I'm concerned. And you lay out that groundwork to say, right, we construct morality. Where do we go from there? Is that fair enough?
Absolutely. It's up to us, and it changes over time, and it's culturally dependent and all those things. That's reality. People say to me, well, if we construct it, then who's to say our morality is any better than the Nazis' morality? It always goes there. Or who's to say that, I'm like, yeah, that's the boat we're in. Good question. We got to argue and debate and define and discuss and explain and give reasons. And there's no out to that. There's no solution. Some people think this and some people think that, and that's the boat we're in. That's reality. And we are the final arbiters of wrong and right, good and bad, moral, immoral. And
do you think religious people have a problem with that? Because humans like certainty, and so therefore, because that's very grey, and we have to do all the work to find our moral kind of proclamations. Like the humans really like certainty, and the divine command theory basis gives you that certainty. You're like, right, brilliant. I can be lazy now. That's fine. I believe that.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. We even have data on it that where you can measure, social psychologists can measure how comfortable or uncomfortable people are with ambiguity. And there's no surprise that the more secular you are, the more atheistic you are, the more comfortable you are with ambiguity, ambiguous situations, ambiguous value judgments. And the more religious you are, the more uncomfortable and threatened you are by ambiguity. And I even go to the work of Erich Fromm here. He was talking more in the political realm, but I think it's relevant here. Erich Fromm was a secular, left-leaning kind of Marxist Freudian, actually, from the 50s and 60s. But he wrote a book called Escape from Freedom. And he said, look, we all think we want freedom. That's everybody likes it. He's like, actually, freedom scares the shit out of most people. Most people are very uncomfortable with freedom. And that gets to the root of Sartre's existentialism as well, that we can be overcome with nausea and fear when we truly have real freedom. Actually, that I think many humans are wired to and more comfortable with, following rules, having clear guidelines, having a magical daddy tell them what to do, when to eat, where to shit, who to have. Because when life is truly free, it's terrifying.
There's something called the paradox of choice, which is the more choice you have, the more you can't make a choice. So you go into a jeans shop and they're like 300 pairs of jeans. You're like, I don't know what a pair of jeans. You spend like 5 hours trying to work. If you go into a jeans shop and there's 2 pairs of jeans, you're like, right, it's either that one or that one. It's that one. Job done. Got a pair of jeans. I'm off.
That's right. And remember, with freedom comes responsibility. So that means you can screw up, you can make wrong choices, and then you bear the brunt, you bear the burden of knowing you screwed up. So I do think there is a social psychological tendency for most people, not all, to want to have a dictator, to want to have an invisible daddy at all times to tell them how to live. And it works well for some people. It's not purely bad. Some people function better that way. But I think it's why it took democracy so long to emerge, and it's still so fragile. It's why the Putins of the world are always so successful, and the Trumps of the world, because people flock to that. They want that kind of thing. And it's also why atheism, I think, only makes so many inroads. It's not to completely reduce to that, but I think most people, yes, they want clear-cut guidelines on how to live. They want clear-cut guidelines on morality. I'll just end. I remember seeing a film, a wonderful film. I think it was called The Conversation. No, not The Conversation, The Separation. It was a Persian film from Iran. It was one of the best films in the last 15 years. And it takes place in contemporary Iran. But one of the characters is a woman who is constantly using her cell phone, and there's a number in Iran where you can call if you have a moral dilemma, and you get a imam or a cleric who will tell you what to do. So you call and you say, "Oh, my boss told me to do this, but I want to do this. What does Allah say to do?" And they just tell you right there, "Oh, according to the Quran and the Hadith and Allah, do this." Thank you. You just you don't have to So on the one hand, it's like, well, some people need that, but you're certainly not a moral agent if you're just following orders. Whether those orders come from a parent, a cleric, or an invisible deity, you're still just obedient, and obedience is not morality for sure.
Yeah, and so when you went on, this is from page 126 from your book. You're like, okay, this is what morality isn't, and it isn't divine command theory. And you go through a bunch of reasons why it isn't. So it's not just an assertion. It's like you
Right.
pick some holes with divine command theory. Which, if you guys watching have seen my videos, I've gone to town on divine command theory a number of times. So yeah, absolutely agree with everything you say. And then you say, what exactly is it that rules us so, morally speaking? And what are the specific foundational sources of our moral proclivities and ethical tendencies? There are four. One, our long history as social primates evolving within a group context of necessary cooperation. Two, our earliest experiences as infants and toddlers being cared for by a mother, father, or other immediate caregivers. Three, unavoidable socialization as growing children and teenagers enmeshed within a culture. And four, ongoing personal experience, increased knowledge, and reasoned, thoughtful reflection. And that encapsulates really morality and doing morality for you. Do you want to say anything to that?
I mean, that's where I think it comes from, and it's a mouthful, right? It's not easy to articulate and explain to someone, because the first one, you have to understand our evolution as a primate species. And if people don't understand that, then there's a lot of work to do there. But we evolved as social beings.
Which is hence reading Franz de Waal, who I've just finished his book, actually.
Exactly.
He's a great primatologist who says a lot about morality. And
Franz de Waal, David Sloan Wilson, there's a whole school of that explains. Evolutionary psychology talks about, look, we evolved this way. This is, and it was evolutionary advantageous. Small bands that didn't cooperate, that couldn't understand each other's feelings, that couldn't empathize with each other and have compassion, they died. They didn't do so well out there in the real world. It's just like, I tell my students, if you ever watch The Walking Dead is awesome, not because of avoiding zombies, but how people survive when there's no authority, there's no law, there's no government, and you're just every group for themselves. And what you find is some of those groups of people are murderous and violent, and they don't survive. They might win this battle, but they turn on each other and they can't cooperate. But it's the groups in Walking Dead of humans that can cooperate, be empathetic, be compassionate, be thoughtful, be mindful of others. They actually have an advantage in this free-for-all.
Sorry, spam time. You should all get the British version of that, which is Metamorphosis, Survival of the Fittest, Metamorphosis, and Adaptation.
Interesting.
Great British zombie moral philosophy books.
Oh, sorry, interesting. Thank you for that. And then there's the fact that we are helpless infants. And so there's a philosopher at UC Davis. Oh gosh, I'm blanking her name, but she's written a lot about caring. I think it's Nell Noddings, and she writes about how as babies we are cared for, our every need, and that primes us and teaches us how to understand what it means to have a need and have that need fulfilled. And that usually mother, not always, but that caregiving experience imprints on us on what it means to be cared for and what it means to receive care, and how that all works. And we only survive as infants because people care for us and protect us and feed us and all that stuff. So that primes us to be moral agents as well. And then, third, we are socialized. So as we grow up, we learn the do's and don'ts of our culture. And most do's and don'ts are pretty universal. It's not, no one wants to be lied to. No one likes to suffer. No one likes to be harmed. Unless, these things are
because those things, I suppose, are underwritten by the golden, the golden rule.
Absolutely, absolutely. And most cultures construct norms and values around those to varying degrees. Yes, there's cultural differentiation about, how to treat animals or this or that. But generally, we learn from our culture how to be good moral beings. And then finally, experience teaches us. We know what it feels like to get punched in the face. We know what it feels like to be lied to. We know what it feels like to have someone else return our wallet when we lost it. And we can think and reflect, and we can read books about things. And that's why people can come to see slavery as wrong, even though for thousands of years it was accepted as biblically accepted. And yet eventually people were like, nah, that doesn't cut it. That took reflection, that took cognition, that took understanding and thought and discussion. And so many things are like that, whether it's women's rights, gay rights, animal rights. So it's not, we're not born with these things necessarily, but we have genetic components to our morality. We have evolutionary components to our morality, social, psychological, and personal and philosophical all together. And again, that's not as smooth as I get my morality from God, but it's the reality we live in. It's complex, but it's there to see if you just want to investigate.
When I read books like yours and dealing with, the importance of those years as parents and the socialization and the care of primary caregivers, and you see all the data. There's an absolutely superb book by Adrian Raine called The Anatomy of Violence, which is one of the best books I've ever read. So there's a book for anyone to dip into. But it connects the causality of things going wrong here to why there's antisocial behavior up here. And whenever I read that, and I was doing this when reading your book, I was like, oh, I've got to be a better parent. I've got to be a better parent. And, I was thinking, oh, I've got to be nicer to my children. I will be nicer to my children. So thank you for that, for those timely reminders. Yes. And what you were saying there, again, kind of reminds me, going back to what we kind of said already, which is when you have to do all this work, rather than just have, it's objectively wrong to murder babies, right? Is something that's so easy. And then me as a moral skeptic, and when I say I'm a moral skeptic, I don't mean that morality doesn't exist at all. I mean that it doesn't exist out there and we have to construct it, like I said earlier. But when I say, right, okay, morality, okay, murdering babies isn't objectively wrong, and then everyone just shoots you because you're like, you're an evil atheist. You're like, no, like it's wrong, but I have to explain why it's wrong. I have to do the legwork here and construct a whole framework that should show you why it's wrong. And you know what? That's me doing that. It's not something up there
exactly
making me say that, or like I'm just following a command. I'm actually doing the moral work.
But exactly, absolutely.
So what you do is you say, right, this is morality. Divine command theory and religious morality isn't very good. This is how we build up morality. So then you get to this part where you're like, okay, where to now? What are the problems we face given this? And one of the first places you go to, which any fun author goes to, is genocide. And so explain why genocide's a big challenge, particularly for secular non-religious people.
Well, I think on that front, if I remember correctly, I was getting this challenge. I particularly got it from a rabbi, but I've gotten it from other people too, who have said, oh, look at the 20th century. Look at, as religion's gone down, as secularization has gone rampant throughout much of the world, what a horrible, if left to humans, look what we have. We have the Holocaust. We have the Soviet, extermination of millions. We have the Khmer Rouge. We have, Rwanda. Like, you're saying that we should leave morality in the hands of humans. That doesn't go so well. And I try to debunk that. And I try to argue that's that's fallacious. And I do that in several ways. One, I actually show that many of the worst atrocities had religious underpinnings and religious components and religious contours and religious participants. Rwanda was the most Catholic country in Africa at the time of the genocide. The Holocaust wouldn't happen if Christianity didn't cast the Jews as Christ killers. And yes, in some cases, there's secular maniacs out there and atheistic killers who commit genocides like Stalin and Mao, no question about it. But what I argue is that the God answer doesn't help us here.
It's worth also noting, I think, in those kind of discussions. I know you don't go into this because it's not about genocide, but as you got to watch out for correlation fallacies. So population goes up, so we have far greater population. Technology improves, so we can kill people far more easily. Absolutely. So imagine, Genghis Khan wasn't going around with like herding people into gas chambers and killing them, and mass transportation and huge weapons that can destroy lots of people at once, right? So what you want to look at is the percentage, what you want to measure is the intention to kill as many people as possible.
And what means did you have available? There's no question that if they had the technology 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, they would have used it. The Protestants and Catholics would have been nuking each other, But so that's for sure true. Thank you. I tried to bring that point up when I was on the Dennis Prager show. But another point that I make is that I see genocides as the end result of ethnocentrism, tribalism, us versus them, nationalism. This is what propels genocidal actions. And what the data shows is that religiosity is highly correlated with nationalism. Religiosity is highly correlated with ethnocentrism. Religiosity is highly correlated with tribalism, meaning that in all the data we have, the more religious a person is, the more nationalistic they are, the more ethnocentric they are, the more tribalistic they are. In fact, the more in-group, out-group they see the world. Thus, I think they're more ready to engage in those kind of immoral actions that sometimes end up as genocide. And the more secular a person is, the more atheist or agnostic they are, the least likely they are to go to church or whatever, the less ethnocentric they are, the less xenophobic they are, the less tribalistic. So to me, I would argue that there's a kind of personality type at play as well.
But so this brings me on to, I think, a really important point I wanted to talk about in this chat, which is not quite the direction of causality, but variables at play and correlations. So I argue with people often when they say, "Oh, religion causes all the war," and I say, "No, religion doesn't cause wars. Religion is a manifestation of tribalism, and it's basically human nature that causes wars. And we're just really good at us and theming." So how much is religion at fault, or how much is actually for any kind of given ill you're going to talk about, or you might talk about, and how much is tribalism at fault, where religion is a really easy thing to use to enforce tribalism, or do you know what I mean?
I think about this a lot. I really struggle with it. I do fall on the side of that tendency to see us versus them, which I think is evolutionary, really is at the root of most of these conflicts. And whatever trappings you put on it, you can make it a nationalistic trapping, you can make it a racial trapping, you can make it a religious trapping. So I do agree that we have I think fundamentally we evolved to cooperate, and we don't like to commit violence. It doesn't feel good. I think we are more peaceful than not, but we do have this other side to us that is, again, part of our bioevolutionary nature. That said, I do believe that religion acts like kerosene or gas to that bonfire. In other words, I see history as religion, even though religion claims that it's about unity and transcending that, and we should love everybody, and we're all the children of God. The reality on the ground is that I feel like religion emboldens the tribalistic. It enhances the nationalistic. It solidifies the xenophobic. So I feel like religion, there's something about the magical thinking. There's something about the God is on our side. There's something about we have a higher calling in this that I think just makes it worse. Just anecdotally, if you look at what's going on in the United States right now with Clarence Thomas and his wife, who were part of the MAGA cult part of the trying to overturn the election and give it to the dictator Trump. In the text messages between Clarence Thomas's wife and the other people facilitating it, it was all for Christ. They said this is for the King of Kings. That tells me a lot. So I don't think we can blame religion for every conflict. In fact, there's many times religion softens these things or makes things better. But my reading of history and my reading of conflict around the world is that religion tends to increase tribalism. Again, sometimes the Khmer Rouge and there are many communistic nightmares out there where genocide and bloodshed and conquest were done in the name of not a god. But most, in my opinion, would
I would contest that maybe by saying it's not done in the name of not a god. It's done in the name of
something else,
of which not a god is some component. But
good point. Absolutely.
James here says religion is. I think I've just briefly read this, and I think he's written this really nicely. Religion is a common major contributor to wars and other wide-scale suffering machines by carrying out and spreading destructive ideological fleas into the societal consciousness. So it's like this is this mechanism by which you can spread otherness and other bad ideas.
And I think those ideological fleas are things like magical thinking, a denial of empiricism, a denial of the scientific method and scientific rigor. I mean, we see that here in the United States where people were denying the reality of COVID and causing suffering. Like, in other words, if you believe in magical thinking and you believe in the power of prayer, these are ideological fleas. They may cause individual comfort. If your child is dying of leukemia, and it's 2 a.m, of course you might want the comfort of, oh God, I'm at the end of my rope. Please help me, love me, tell me everything's going to be okay. But at the societal level, at the national level, at the government level, at the political level, magical thinking is destructive. Faith is destructive. And believing that one is doing what one is doing because they're following a God is destructive. Have reasons, have sound reasons for your positions, your actions, your motivations. Do not, the minute you say it's the devil, it's God, then we're lost, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something that's central to the first book I was talking about, the non-religious, which is kind of some of the more negative sides of humanity that are correlated quite well with the religious, more religious people, particularly as you raise degrees of religiosity, depending on how you measure that, then you raise degrees of other things like authoritarian thinking. I mean, is there a few bits of data you want to express here in terms of what do we commonly see with higher, more religious people?
Yeah, so I've already mentioned that the more religious you are, the more likely you are to be uncomfortable with ambiguity, the more likely you are to be tribalistic, but the more likely you are to have that what psychologists call the authoritarian personality, to want to be told how to live, to want to follow orders. That's why obedience is I've even seen research where parents are asked, okay, what traits or characteristics are most important in cultivating in your children? As if we have that control, but if we did, and they give them, 50 to choose from, artistic, expression might be one, or following orders, or thinking for oneself, or questioning authority, or obeying authority. And what you find is the more religious the parent, the more obedience to authority goes to the number one slot, and thinking for oneself goes down to the bottom. And the more secular the parent, the thinking for oneself rises to the top and obedience to authority rises to the bottom. I think that's I'm proud of that. I think, democracy relies on us thinking for ourselves, and morality relies on us thinking for ourselves. And so there's definitely a correlation, but it's a strong and robust correlation.
Yeah. Which speaks of causality. So correlation, isn't just correlation. There's causality going on most of the time somewhere. And it also talks about that data also seems to correlate well with believing in an Old Testament God, the God of the Hebrew Bible, who's a jealous God. If that's your kind of God, then you're more likely to be an authoritarian sort of person. Absolutely. And you're more likely to want that of your children. There's something called I think it's philosopher Paul Draper talks about the meager moral fruits argument. So this is really, and I wonder what you have to say to this, because I think that you've got loads of data to support this. And the idea is that, so this is called an abductive argument, an argument to the inference to the best explanation, which is what does this data best, is it best explained by atheism or theism, right? So you say, okay, if theism was true, a particular God was true, you would expect the people who believed in that God to be better moral agents than anyone else in the world. That's what you would expect. Like because theism appears to be just basically all about morality, like Keenan Malik said earlier on. That seems to be what life's all about, like getting towards some kind of moral consensus or whatever. So if you think that a particular God exists, then you would expect that the people who believed in that God to be better moral agents. But that doesn't appear to be the case at all. It appears that broadly everyone's about the same kind of morality, but you could argue that certain religious people are less moral in very many ways. And so the meager moral fruits argument, I think, is a really interesting argument. I think it's particularly is defended by data as well as being what it is broadly about data. It's saying, look, what do we see when we look at the world? Is morality broadly randomly kind of like thrown about, or are there pockets of people who are more moral than others? And does that correlate with particular religions and whatnot?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a thorny game to try and do that, but there's no question that, oh, look, I have a Johnny Pierce interview in 15 minutes. Okay. There's my reminder. I guess what I would say is yes, and I try to do this actually in my writing. I've written some pieces on Only Sky. I wrote something for The Humanist. But if you define morality as, there's many ways to define it, as alleviating unwanted suffering, trying to increase fairness and goodness, treating people the way you would want to be treated, not in an exact sense, but in a general sense, et cetera, then I would argue that on a host of measures, the more religious you are, the less moral you are. We can just take COVID here in the United States. No one wants to suffer from COVID. No one wants to inflict an illness on somebody else. No one wants to die with their lungs full, unable to breathe. Children lose parents. Parents lose grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, who was more willing to sacrifice, their personal freedoms or whatever for the good of all? It was the atheists. The atheists were the most likely to follow the stay in place orders, to wear masks in public, to get vaccinated. And the more strongly religious were the most likely to flaunt those things. I'm not going to wear masks. I'm not going to get vaccinated. Well, you just increase suffering. All you're doing is cheering on the virus.
What's going on there? Because that's interesting, because you say on the one hand, they are more likely to follow orders apart from certain orders, apart from when those orders come from, because it becomes so...
Well, they don't follow orders in a literal sense. They think they're following orders, but look, if any Christian followed orders, they'd be a communist. I mean, they would be getting rid of their personal possessions. They would be, pacifists. Here in the United States, the more Christian you are, the more likely you are to own a gun, the more likely you are to support gun ownership. Like, there's no correlation between, it's not that they actually are following the orders. It's that they do what they want to do, but claim to be following orders from a divine God.
So that's brilliant. So this then comes back to, I've written articles on this before, and this is your area here. So it's the causality going on here. So does politics drive religion, or does religion drive politics? So from what I gather from the data, it appears that actually politics drives religion. And one of the ways you can see this is that people change churches quite easily. So if the church that they belong to doesn't agree with their politics, they will go and find a church that does, which is to say that actually the religious content that's being delivered by this church isn't really the important bit. I've already got the important bit, which is my political worldview, and I will search out the religion that comports to that. Is that fair to say?
I think it's both and. I mean, yes, I think the data, Ryan Berg is showing a lot of this too, at least in the US context. Again, I can't speak to Vietnam or Bolivia, but from the societies that I'm familiar with, I would say that yes, most of the time people are using religion to justify a political position or a racial position or a whatever, a military position, and then they find something in their religion to justify it. I think that's usually the case. However, I would still argue that I don't see religion as purely derivative or epiphenomenal or after the fact. Sometimes, in some instances, I do believe the claims of religion do also motivate people and shape the way they look at the world. For example, patriarchy. I do think religion has had a huge hand in shaping a patriarchal worldview, a patriarchal notion that runs deeper than just people's political proclivities.
That's interesting. And you wonder then if as a child you're taking in these stories which are
Exactly.
deeply steeped in patriarchal kind of tropes. You're taking
Exactly.
them on at the age of 3 onwards and
The whole
understanding these
structure.
stories. And
Exactly. You're going to internalize that regardless of where where your politics go. And they reinforce each other. They reinforce each other for sure.
interesting, really, really interesting. So as well as genocide being an area that you say, right, we've got to deal with this as secular people, as non-religious people, we've got to deal with this because this is what is thrown at us as a criticism for, when we are trying to establish that our morality is in some sense correct or right or better or whatever. And the other aspect you talk about is moral relativism. Why is moral relativism a thorn in the side of seculars?
Yeah, that's the hardest one. I mean, that's the real tricky part because there's different levels to moral relativism and what we mean by moral relativism. But I'll give you an example. If I say to a religious person or anybody, if I say to them, okay, you're driving your car into a town you've never been before, you want to talk to those people, and you get out of your car and you want to talk to them about, I don't know, Bible or global warming or whatever, and you knock on their door and they shoot you, they see you coming and they shoot you. Is that murder? They'll say like, yes, of course, that's murder. But then when you talk about the Christian missionary who wanted to go to this protected island off the coast of India, this was about 3 or 4 years ago. You can look it up.
Yeah, I remember this.
There's an island with indigenous inhabitants that have not interacted with the rest of the world ever, and they're protected by the UN and by everybody. Like, leave them be. They live on their island. They don't want to be part of our world. And this guy paid someone to take him in a boat against international law, and he got off of that boat with his Bible to teach them the good news, and they threw spears at him and killed him. Are they just as guilty murder? Should we go and arrest them right now? Should we execute them? And of course, right away, people will see that these things are different. They'll think, okay, so right away, they'll acknowledge that morality is relative to certain situations, certain contexts. But with moral relativism, I think the harder part is when we recognize that we ourselves are always shaped by our culture, and there's no way to avoid that. And if everybody is shaped by a given particular culture, what do we do when different cultures have different norms and values? There's no cosmic umpire. There's no objective yardstick to say, well, this is right and this is wrong. And it's very, very thorny. And I did my best to lay out why it's thorny, to lay out what some people have suggested are ways out. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's a clear-cut case. I struggle with this all the time. He got himself killed by arrows. Yeah, exactly. I agree. But still, even that, James, you're acknowledging that morality is, navigatable, debatable, discussable, related to different larger contexts.
I wonder if that perhaps is another interesting example of this, which is much more within a culture. So crime of passion.
Yeah.
So we say, you start saying, well, okay, there's a bit of understanding of what's going on from the context here of who this person was, rather than this person killed that person. Well, right. That's obviously wrong. There you go. You're going to get whatever the sentencing is. It's like, oh, it's a wife now that's been, and then it's like, beaten by the husband, and then you're contextualizing.
Exactly. That's
and
the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
But I think a big problem with cultural relativism, though, is, okay, let's take the example of I have a friend, a colleague, she's an anthropologist, she's from Brazil, and she studies indigenous peoples in the Brazilian rainforest. She described to me being among a certain tribe that found pleasure and entertainment in placing a turtle on a fire upside down on its shell and watching it burn to death. And they found the suffering and squirming of the turtle hysterical, and they would sit around, men, women, and children, elders, laughing at this evening's entertainment. Now that totally offends my moral sensibilities. Right, but
Wow.
it only offends my moral sensibilities because of the culture that it raised me. Had I been raised there, I'd be laughing as well. So the dilemma is, if I think I have a right to step into that rainforest and say, you can't do that, the turtle's suffering, do they have a right to say, actually, you should, we're going to come to LA and we're going to have turtle burnings because they are really fun and entertaining? And why is my right to tell them how to behave supersede their right to tell me how to behave?
So
And
you come at this with a bunch of ways that you can deal with this, right?
I try
Which
my
are
best. Yeah.
because I would be of the opinion as a philosopher that they are wrong, and they are wrong in some kind of way that so it's all about function machines, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. So if you're going to put stuff that is incorrect, if you're going to start with some axioms down here that are broadly incorrect, like for example, like animals don't feel pain in the same way humans do, and they don't have minds in the same then you're going to come up with stuff that's incorrect up here. So I would start with like, okay, well, if we get this stuff right here, which is broadly to say, if we're all starting from the same
Right.
position, we will all have the same opinions if we all are sound of mind and use correct logic, blah blah blah. But that's easier said than done.
Well, what you're doing is you're engaging in conversation, and to me, that's one of the answers. So it's not about resorting
I
to
kind of
violence.
I beat you to it, but
Yeah, I mean,
there are
that's to
several
me.
ways of.
Yes, I tried to lay out several, but at the end of the day, we have to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And we have to accept that we actually are genetically brothers and sisters. Darwin has a stronger case for our universal relation than the Islam or Christianity. We are actually all of the same species, and we have the data to prove it. So we can treat each other as family members, meaning we treat each other with love and respect, but we may have disagreements, and we have to work through those disagreements, hopefully non-violently.
Yes, and I really like that. It's, oh goodness, it's in there somewhere. I was going to read a little part about that, about saying I really like the fact that you said, very explicitly, we are all in the same family here, and so therefore, let's get together and let's talk about it. And so you talk about several different ways you can approach that's it, one human family. That's obviously what it's called. And you talk about Sam Harris's sort of approach in the moral landscape and saying well-being, if well-being is our goal, then we can use science to be able to achieve our goal, and it's a self-evident truth, well-being, so therefore we should all be doing this to maximize well-being. So therefore, if they're not doing that, they are wrong. They're just morally wrong, which is one way of going about dealing with moral relativism.
I have some qualms. There's some things I agree with from Sam, and some things I don't, because I don't think well-being is always clear-cut.
It's all about the goal. So to me, morality is goal-oriented, right? So it's always about, so when you say, and I apologize to the viewers who've heard me say this countless times, but when you say, you should do this, right? That's an ought statement. And what you're doing is so a conditional statement, an if-then statement, relies on what's called a protasis and an apodosis. The protasis is, if you want this, and the apodosis is, then you should do this. What we do when we do morality is we forget the if part, and we say you should do this, right?
Exactly.
And so therefore it's devoid of the context, or sorry, not the context, the goal. And what we're very bad at doing, and actually we should do this in the world now, right? Politics is kind of pointless. Politics is morality writ large, right? But no one sits down and says, what is the world? What do we want the world to look like? This should be the most important conversation. I've got shivers again, sorry, and I'm banging on, but this is the most important conversation anyone should be having, because until you work out what world you want, you can't start having a moral conversation, because morality, in my opinion, is goal oriented, and so you've got to sort out your goals first.
I agree. Well said. I love it. I love listening to you, Jonathan. It's so great.
And so, but in order to, talk about what your goals are, you have to have conversations. Why is that goal better than this goal? What is so self-evidently brilliant about that goal, etc., etc.? And then, okay, what's the best way about achieving that goal? Then that's another conversation. So I'm going to quote you, if you don't mind. This is page 276 and 277, where you say, and this is your other way of dealing with moral relativism, which is your reasoning part. We must appeal to principles and ideals. We must defend our viewpoint with facts, logic, stories, and examples. And in turn, we must strive to listen to those who disagree with us, and we must consider their reasons with the same earnestness that we would like them to consider our own. So that's a really nice start there. And then you go on to say the only option in such a situation, you talked about another situation, open discussion and democratic debate among earth-dwelling men and women, the respectful airing of our ethical differences and the confident sharing of our culture-bound perspectives. For, as Mary Midgley states, ethical deliberation demands a vaster horizon of insights and possibilities that any single society can supply, given that morality's field of reference is the world. And sorry, just going on again. As ongoing clashes of morality perpetually flare up, we will most likely never fully agree about this or that practice. Such is life, such is reality. Moral deliberation and ethical development will never be done or finished, but rather will always constitute arenas of ongoing debate and disagreement, so long as there are humans to speak, act, feel, reflect, fear, imagine, and care. And to think that there is some definitive, absolute, universal, objective approach to all moral dilemmas, an ethical holy grail, just waiting to be discovered, that will put an end to debate and disagreement once and for all, is to dwell in a state of childlike fantasy, pining for some magical security blanket that is simply not to be found in the cosmos. Boom, drop mic. Thank you. See you later.
Thanks for that. Man, that was fun. Fun to hear that. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah.
Do you listen to some of your own writing and go, God, that was good?
Yeah.
It's like this epiphenomenalistic sort of like, sometimes when I listen to myself speak, I'm a kind of epiphenomenalist, whereas like I think that there's a non-conscious mind is just doing everything, right? And sometimes I listen to, like right now, I'm listening to my words. So there's this feedback loop where I say something, I listen to it and go, that was good. Do you know what I mean? As if like I'm listening to someone else.
There you go. Thanks, Jonathan. That was fun. That was fun for me. So I have to wrap it up if that's okay. I hope an hour is okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, can we finally keep on where we go from here? Like, which is like the conclusion. What this is, I mean, I would love to. I've got another hour and a half of speaking to you in my head now, but obviously that, we're happy to do that again. Like, where do we go from here? And this is too big to answer quickly, but it's connecting it to politics and then what we're doing at Only Sky and all that stuff. That's where it was going to go. But just to wrap it up, where would you want to go from now? What's your conclusion?
I would want people's morality to be based on the alleviation of suffering, a sort of general agreement that suffering is not good. No one wants to suffer. And that, I think, should be a guiding principle. And that's where we should start. I mean, I like the way you talked about, like, well, if this, then that. So let's start with, if we want to alleviate suffering. And I find that, for example, even with the COVID debate here in the United States, we shouldn't have to wear masks. I kind of stop and I say, do you think more people are going to get sick or less people are going to get sick? Do you think more people are going to suffer or less people are going to suffer? And then I think that's the approach. So I think we need to link our politics with an alleviation of suffering. And so when you want universal health care, it's because you think it's going to alleviate suffering. If you want to put better regulations on assault weapons, it's because it's going to alleviate suffering. And so that's where I try to have the conversation that I can with people that disagree with me. And there's a lot of nasty disagreements right now in this world. It's the rifts are getting worse. And what we saw, sorry, I'm from LA, but what we saw in the Academy Awards was just like the classic example of a guy who claims to be a vessel of God and then just smacks another human being. It's just like, come on, that's our basest, worst impulses being legitimized through religion. But I think where we go from here is we have to try to be humble and open and try to alleviate suffering. And I guess I would end with, make allies where we can. So I don't need someone to be an atheist to support my goals. I don't need someone to be secular to support the alleviation of suffering. And there's many, many theists out there who agree with us on a host of ways to make the world a better place. And I think we should be working with them. But we should not allow the religious to continue this claim that they hold the moral compass. It's simply not so. It's destructive.
And that's what your book is primarily, at least starting off saying, which is they don't hold the moral compass. The moral compass is within us. Yeah. And I advise everyone to go out and buy this book. It really is a very, very good book. Phil, I would love to speak to you again if that's okay in the future, because
Let's
I'd
do it.
love to actually. I think there's an awful lot that we haven't said. I mean, it's a big book,
Yes.
right? There's an awful lot we haven't talked about concerning the book, but the connections of religiosity and non-religion and politics, I think, is really, really, really vital to talk about. And I think also what we're doing at Only Sky and trying to join the dots there, and as a project to get more representation and to change the political and moral landscape in for example America, is, I think,
Exactly.
we need to talk about that.
Thanks, Jonathan, for the work you're doing. So great to connect, and I can't wait to do it again.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to stay on for a little bit and have a chat, but thank you so much, Phil. I really do appreciate it. You take care. All the best. So that was Phil Zuckerman, and I thank him hugely for that hour he spent with us, especially since it was supposed to be an hour later, but daylight savings has just changed and we cocked that up. But thank you all for listening in, those who are here live. There was I think he's got a lot to say for himself, Phil, and rightly so. He's a brilliant mind with a great back catalogue of writing himself and data. Really worth looking at. His books, the two books I've read of his are really, really great. I just wanted to finish off just mentioning what I was just saying there, which is, this we want, connecting what we talked about with morality and what we think morality might be and what it isn't, and then looking at the political world around us and what do we do with that. And his conclusion in the book is to say, well, we need these discussions. We need democracy, a fully functioning democracy. And one of the things that I think is that really what I wanted to end talking about today is, and I must read it, but there's a report that's just come out recently that's saying that democracy in most countries in the world is backsliding at the moment. And this is a real problem. All around the world, even in the EU, places like Hungary and actually Poland, where they're getting much more authoritarian leadership in place that are then stifling democratic institutions and values and changing the legislation all around the world. And America, you look at the legislation that's trying to be changed in the voter laws, rather than trying to make as many people vote as possible, as easily as possible, they're trying to put in many Republican states, are trying to put things in place that make it much harder to vote, and particularly for certain types of people. And so you can argue that the US is backsliding, democratically speaking, but all around the world, the data is suggesting that actually we're at a period of time just now where democracy is backsliding. And that's a real worry. And this has come to a point in Ukraine. So what were Ukraine trying to do? They were trying to exercise their democratic right, their sovereign right as an independent nation to do what they wanted to do, irrespective of what that was, cozy up to NATO or whatever. They wanted to join the EU. Putin says, no, I don't want that to happen, as an authoritarian leader, and invades the country to stop that happening. So what's happening in Ukraine is the most powerful expression at the moment of democratic backsliding, and it's a forced democratic backsliding. So when you want to make the world a better place, that is not making the world a better place in a massive way that's effectively destroying an entire nation just so they can't exercise their democratic rights. You've got to fight for democracy. And sadly, in America, you've got a two-party system, which is like the narrowest form of democracy. It's first past the post, and all these kind of problems you have with the actual institutions. You've got the electoral college, which is not democratic. And you need a root and branch change, I would state, in America, such that the mechanisms of doing democracy are improved, that the checks and balances are made more robust, that people can't buy power, that lobbying is taken care of, and it's a real problem. But what Zuckerman talks about, what Phil talks about in this book, is saying, well, actually, the sorts of people that seem to like these values, happen to also be the non-religious people. And you know, let's try and secularize the world, because those people tend to be the morally, you know, better people as far as but then of course I'm going to say that because I'm one of those people, and that their kind of morality syncs with my kind of morality. So, you know, it's about questioning everything. But I think joining the dots is super important here. It's not just about, you know, reading a book like that and going, okay, yeah, divine command theory is bad, and religious morality and is bad, and, you know, the more religious you are, the more problematic, you know, social structures are for those kind of peoples, and etc. etc. Okay, brilliant, nice book, thanks. It's like, what do we do with that now? It's like, okay, I need to somehow help, you know, improve the world in a very real way. And, you know, this is what I'm doing in doing these videos. But, you know, those people working hard on the front lines and volunteering and going out and trying to improve the democratic, you know, institutions and mechanisms in whatever country you're in, super important. You know, hats off to people that spend their days trying to make their own country's mechanisms better for everyone. And they're the unsung heroes, I think, of democracy. You know, anyway, I'm kind of going off on one, but thank you so much for checking the video out and for, you know, joining in. Thanks to all the usuals who are saying things. I try to remind myself that it's all physics, that the math simply was always going to generate the current shifts and paradigms. Yeah, it's a genius what did it, and all that. VA, vaguely agnostic, what a legend. But how do you have a discussion with white nationalists who want an autocratic government? Takes two sides for discussions, and the secular atheists seem to be the only ones that want to sit at the table. This is a great conversation to be having. So it's like, how do you change people's minds? And thank you, by the way, that's really, really generous. Again, VA, that's vaguely agnostic. So thank you. How do you change people's minds? Jonathan Haidt would say, the moral psychologist, would say, if you want to change someone's mind, it's a bit like riding an elephant next to someone. So instead of, you know, you can imagine the white nationalist, autocratic religious person here, and the atheist here, liberal atheist here, for example. That isn't going to change their mind. In fact, you're more likely to get the backfire effect, where this person entrenches in their original position. So what you want is, imagine riding an elephant, where the elephant just kind of gently nudges the other elephant, you know, gradually. What you want is someone in your own in-group. So instead of an atheist coming against a white nationalist, it's like another religious person that just happens to be less authoritarian than this religious person, who's therefore loosely in their in-group, who then, you know, nudges them, and then someone else takes over and nudges them. And it's a much healthier 180 change than butting up against someone who's diametrically opposed to your position. This is the example I often give of my friend who we started the Tippling Philosophers together. Rob, he's been on here a number of times, but he used to deny evolution as a conservative Christian when he was a conservative Christian. And I argued him within 7 years of giving him arguments for evolution, and he didn't take it on at all. But I must have sowed a little seed, because he emailed Simon Conway Morris, who's an evolutionary biologist at Cambridge University, who's a Christian, who then said all the same arguments as I gave. And then my friend was like, oh, okay, yeah. In other words, you know, it's not the content, it's the person who delivers it. So as a liberal atheist, I might give a certain content that this white nationalist autocrat religious person will absolutely not take on, because it's like that. But if you have a slightly more liberal Christian and your white nationalist autocratic Christian, given the same content, it's much more likely to find purchase. And so therefore, sadly, you know, changing people's minds a lot about psychology, and who delivers it and how they deliver it is almost as important as what they deliver. There's you know, I don't know if I'm teaching grandmother to suck eggs here, but hopefully that kind of answers a question, vaguely agnostic, which is to say that sometimes it's almost impossible for someone like us to convince someone like them of a particular position. I have people on my blog who have been arguing that I've allowed on there who are effectively racist, but I don't shut down like problematic speech. I try and fight it with reason. So I'm quite big on freedom of speech. Slightly different at Only Sky now because they have moderation rules that I'm not in control of. But certainly when I used to be at Pathos Non-Religious, but invariably, actually, I couldn't change their minds, and we couldn't change their minds because they're so entrenched in their position that just who we are invalidated us as people who were able to change their minds, and that's quite sad. But that's the reality. So I don't know that there's an answer to that other than trying to find people who are loosely in the in-group of people to change their minds. James, talking about what we're just saying there in terms of the political structures in the US. I don't feel empowered in America as a citizen, so I try to focus more on what I can control, aspects of my own life, and planting seeds for a better tomorrow into the societal consciousness. Brilliant. Perhaps, and I was going to say this to Phil earlier in the interview, which is that sometimes the Socratic method is the best. Someone contacted me yesterday, said my brother has this really problematic view. I don't know. I need to have a conversation with him. How should I go about it? And we had this discussion where I was saying that one of the best ways might be the Socratic dialect, which is Socrates is really famous for winning arguments by just asking questions. It's how coaching happens nowadays, modern coaching, where you get someone to realize things or to change their minds or whatever just by questioning them. And it might be that's the best way to approach someone who's completely opposite to you, which is not to say, I believe this, therefore you should believe this. But it's just something like, do you want the world to be a better place? Yes. Okay. Do you think if you did this, the world would be a better place, or would it be a worse place? Do you know what I mean? Or if you wanted to do less harm, or if you wanted to do, and therefore it's just about releasing realization in people through questioning them rather than through telling them. That's not to say that I do that particularly well, but if I did it well, I would probably be a much better person at changing other people's minds. So there you go. Ron, good old Ron, who's a chaplain himself. When I was 8 years old in 1952, religious groups were hijacking the word democracy to promote spiritual development. And it's the use of religious groups to and this happened even more from the 1970s onwards with the birth of the neocons in the US, where they really got into bed. The Republican Party particularly got into bed with the religious right and that kind of using religion and culture wars and all these kind of things to deliver political power. But yeah, there you go. Anyway, thank you so much for everyone. I hope that discussion with Phil was really interesting for you and thought-provoking. I'll hope to get him on again because I really feel there's a lot more to talk about, and both his books that I've read are superb. What It Means to Be Moral and The Non-Religious, Understanding Secular People and Societies, both fantastic books. And I just before I just bang on about something else, this is James. I do the Socratic method against my own self. Whenever my thinking gets stuck, I ask myself questions and then imagine someone else is asking me, and then I take a new inventory to provide an answer. So you can it's a good method, the Socratic method, and asking questions. You could have some kind of split personality disorder there where you can try and like win an argument against yourself or change your own mind just by asking yourself questions. But thanks to those of you who have got hold of 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design. It's a nice, easy read. Please let me know what you think in any future comments. And if you like it, please put a review on Amazon. That's really, really important. And if you don't like it, just forget you've never read it and don't tell anyone. Shh. but I'm sure you like it. What's not to like? Thanks, James. It was a very thought-provoking discussion, and I will get those books. We'll even get the zombie books. Oh, thank you so much. It's really kind. And would love to hear him talk on his first book. Yeah, I mean, this is he said it is really dry. I mean, it's an academic book by point of fact. I don't think it's dry. I think it's fascinating. But this is really great if you want like ammunition for actual data on what religious people and non-religious people believe and why they believe it, like connecting the dots and what's the causality going on there, and are they so for example, I've used this in so many pieces I've written to do with are religious people more moral? Do they give more to charity? And there's a lot of work, and I've actually done a video on this before. What's really going on there? What are they actually giving? Are they more moral and more charitable to people in their own in-groups? Yes, they are. So actually, are they more universally moral? No. It turns out that the higher religiosity you have, the more likely you are to give to your in-group, and the less likely you are to be moral to the out-group. Whereas if you're secular, the more likely you are to be universally moral, which is kind of moral to everyone, irrespective of whether they are in-group or out-group. And so the religious person might give more money, but it turns out that they give more money to their church, right? Because they're giving tithes and this and that, and that's seen as charity. So when you're counting up the charitable giving, it turns out that, they're giving to their own church an awful lot, or they're giving to organizations that are sending Bibles to Haiti or whatever. Whereas like the secular person is, Disasters and Emergency Commission that's helping out people universally, or Doctors Without Borders or whatever. This is a more universal idea of charitable giving. So the devil is in the detail. It's really easy for religious people to say, oh, religious people are more moral because look, they give more money to charity. It's like, yeah, who are they giving to, and what's their end game? And is it about status in their own community? Because actually it's about church tithing and so on and so forth. It's a lot more complex. Yes. So anyway, thank you all. Great for you to hang out. Thank you for super chats, Vaguely Agnostic. Awesome. Thank you for all of your support. I want to say thank you publicly to Justus in the last talk as one of the people who was very generous with his South African donation. So thank you very much. It's really, really important. And I will be around and again soon. I don't know what to talk on. I'm hopefully going to be doing an interview with David Madison, who's just written a book on sort of dodgy things that Jesus said, which is a great book. It's not called that. I can't remember the exact title. But it's a great, nice, easy book to read that. And Shelley Segal, who's an Australian singer-songwriter, whose Atheist album is an absolutely blinding set of songs. Shelley Segal, really, really, really lovely. So I'm in touch with her. I should be interviewing her soon. So on and so forth. So I've got more interviews coming. But thanks. Take care. Question everything, particularly yourselves. Toodle pips.